Good morning, class. The last lecture we talked about platelet. Hello. अब मैं क्लास ले रहा हूँ, मैं कॉल बैक करता हूँ. So we talked about platelet functions and thrombocytopenia, and we'll take up from there. So how to approach patients with thrombocytopenia. Basically, thrombocytopenia is when you call platelet count less than 1.5 lakhs per microliter, and whenever you found a patient with a platelet count less than this, you approach such patients with measurement of hemoglobin and WBC, and they are normal, then you look for the peripheral smear, and on peripheral smear you look for the RBC morphology and the WBC morphology and the platelet morphology and the size, and is there any abnormal cells, whether in the form of fragmented RBCs or even if they are normal, then you can consider a few particular entities like drug-induced thrombocytopenia, infection-induced thrombocytopenia, idiopathic immune thrombocytopenia, or congenital thrombocytopenia. And if on peripheral smear if you found the RBCs fragmented, then the most probable diagnosis will be microangiopathic hemolytic anemia, and where the most common cause is thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura and DIC. And if hemoglobin and WBCs are abnormal along with the low platelet count, then obviously you have to proceed with the bone marrow examinations. So that is how we approach the patient with thrombocytopenia, and thrombocytopenia is a very common it's a very common finding and a very common occurrence in usually clinical practice, but usually clinically any platelet count less than 50,000, that is supposed to be significant. So basically we talked about the hemostasis, and we talked about the primary hemostasis and secondary hemostasis, and the primary was basically because of the platelet function and the platelet plugs, but the secondary is when the clotting factors come into action. And usually the bleeding events in the platelet defects will be in the form of mucocutaneous, superficial bleeds or mucocutaneous bleed on nasal gastrointestinal or genitourinary sites. It may be wet or dry. The wet bleeds are usually in the form of wet purpura or usually in the mucous membrane, and dry ones are more superficial on the skin. But deep tissue bleeding, especially the joints and muscles, usually happens in clotting factor deficiencies. And excessive bleeding again can happen with minor cuts in cases of platelet defects, because you have a problem with the bleeding, and basically so. And petechiae is very common. And what are petechiae? Petechiae is basically small or small RBC, small flat erythematous patch, which is maybe up to 1 millimeter in size, and which is a non-blanching usually, and a non-palpable. It's a very small. You'll find petechiae in the dependent area and non-dependent area of the body. And while it is not very common in cases of clotting factor, but ecchymosis is very common, which is usually a large, or you can say a coalescence of petechiae or a large subcutaneous collection of blood, something close to hematoma, and usually it forms a subcutaneous and soft tissue hematomas. And hemarthrosis and muscle hematomas are very uncommon in cases of platelet defects, which is more common in cases of clotting factors. And bleeding with surgery is very immediate with the cases of platelet defects, and it's little delayed in cases of coagulation profile defects. So when we talk about when platelet is very low, usually life-threatening is one where you have less than 20,000 platelets, which might such patient may require hospitalization, or less than 10,000 have a chances of a spontaneous intracranial hemorrhage, which is again a very grave problem. And platelet disorders can be quantitative and qualitative, and can be defined depending on the quantity as well as quality. And basically, overall, the most common reasons comes under these four. Either there will be increased production of platelets, or increased consumption or destruction of platelets, or through the splenic sequestration. And there can be an entity called pseudo thrombocytopenia, where because of antibody develops, as in EDTA, the way the samples are collected, they might have a microaggregation of platelets in the sample, and that will lead to a mismatch as far as the numbers of platelets are concerned. So failure in production is mostly because of the bone marrow is basically responsible for production of platelets. So any bone marrow suppression, either will be drug induced, or conditions like aplastic anemia or parvovirus infection, very common infection which is associated with bone marrow suppression. Then bone marrow infiltration through metastasis or malignancies, which can be even a non-hematological malignancy. Severe B12 and folate deficiency is one very frequent cause of bone marrow suppression and leading to thrombocytopenia. Then platelet consumption or destruction, which can happen in gestational thrombocytopenia, which is a very common occurrence in gestational thrombocytopenia, where as low as 1 lakh platelet per microliter will be found, but this is mostly a self-remitting problem. Then you can have if you talk about immune thrombocytopenic purpura, and immune thrombocytopenic is in form of primary and secondary. It can be associated with the SLE, antiphospholipid syndrome, or a drug-induced infection. Then non-immune thrombocytopenia can be in the form of TTP, DIC, preeclampsia, or acute fatty liver of pregnancy. Then splenic sequestration can take place in liver diseases, especially cirrhosis or portal hypertensions, or even hepatic and portal vein thrombosis, and splenomegaly, or leading to hypersplenism, myeloproliferative and lymphoproliferative disorders, and even a tropical infection like malaria, where you can have a splenic sequestration. So increased platelet destructions, basically, which is leads to high reticulate count, and its various conditions can be grouped together under immune thrombocytopenic purpura, thrombotic microangiopathies, post-transfusion purpura, or heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, or DIC. So we'll talk about idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura in this class. Basically, the immunological thrombocytopenic purpura is very common, or the most common cause of thrombocytopenia in children, and its result is basically because of immunologically mediated increased platelet destruction. So it can be congenital, it can be hereditary, and hereditary is more common in females, and it is one of the most common thrombocytopenia you will be able to see in the normal population. Etiology is basically very complex. Usually the predisposing factors are viral infection, mostly rubella, or CNC, or CMV, or cytomegalovirus, or measles. That's a 4-week interval. And then there can be a drug induced, which cause reacting with platelets or foreign antigens, or it can be certain alteration in the reticuloendothelial system tolerance, or genetic, which has not been very conclusive. So what happens over here? There will be a disordered immune response during a recovery from a viral infection, and that will evoke a formation of antibodies against a platelet destruction. So the viral antigen will induce our own antigen to evoke formation of antibodies, and mostly the platelet antibodies will be against the glycoprotein 2B and 3A, which we saw in the last class, which is basically responsible for aggregation of platelets and after subsequent adherence of platelet to the damaged endothelium. So what happens, there is another one of the hypotheses which basically implicates immune complexes which are deriving from primary underlying process, and they basically absorb on the surface of platelets and leading to upsonization and rapid destruction. That can be mostly an alternate pathway or a complement mediated. So mostly pathogenesis which have been hypothesized is viral infection leading to immune complexes in the platelet surface and destruction and removal of the by the radical endothelial system, the liver and the spleen, and subsequently leading to thrombocytopenia. So basically it affects mostly the children between 2 to 10 years of age, and boys and girls are usually affected, and history of infection prior to 1 to 4 weeks, and usually an upper respiratory tract infection, chickenpox, rubella, hepatitis, measles or pertussis, and there will be a sudden onset of petechiae or purpura a few days or weeks after an infectious illness, and which can be accompanied by mucosal surface or hemorrhagic bullae or gums or nosebleed. So what is important to know that these it's not very frequent even after only an insult or provocating factors working. The patient will come to you or the child will come to you, and most probably with epistaxis or repeated epistaxis or a gum bleed, and the potential complication we know is intracranial hemorrhage, which is rare, and it's a very serious complication, but usually patient comes with the mild symptoms. नहीं जाता कब से नहीं जाता
को बोला था इसे
इतना बोल भी लिया मुझे पता ही नहीं चला कब से नहीं आता था
पता नहीं सिर्फ मैसेज नहीं आ रहा था
मेरे को मैसेज तो देखो So shall we start again? I mean, I don't know where we lost connection. I have no clue where we lost connection. Shall we start again? So again, going back to we talked about the most common cause for thrombocytopenia is either gonna be a failure of production, or increased platelet consumption, or splenic sequestration, and the failure of production can be through the bone marrow suppression, and which can be drug induced or aplastic anemia or infection like parvovirus B12, which is very commonly associated with aplastic anemia, or bone marrow infiltration, and then can have a malignancies or B12 or folate deficiency, which is very common in the normal population. Then there is an entity called gestational thrombocytopenia, and that is a common occurrence, and that can lead to common platelet consumption, but it's a self-limiting problem. Then you have immune thrombocytopenia, which we're going to talk about. This is a primary and secondary. Secondary is associated with SLE, antiphospholipid syndrome, drug-induced or infections. Then we have something called non-immune thrombocytopenia in the form of DIC, TTP, preeclampsia, and acute fatty liver of pregnancy. Then splenic sequestration can be in the form of liver disease or portal hypertension, or hepatic portal vein thrombosis, or splenomegaly, and myeloproliferative and lymphoproliferative disorders, and even malaria infection. So basically, most importantly, very important causes are ITP, thrombotic thrombocytopenic microangiopathies, post-transfusion purpura, heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, and DICs. So we'll talk about the ITP. ITP is also called immunological thrombocytopenic purpura, and most commonly it is thrombocytopenia in children and a result of immunologically mediated increased platelet destruction. But the point is the etiology is still not very clear, and the pathogenesis is very complex, where you have a viral infection in the form of rubella or even measles, and that is up to 4 weeks of interval, and or any immune factors like foreign antigen or drug cross reactions, or any splenic or reticular endothelial system alterations, or even genetic, which is not still described, and that will lead to cause a consequential disordered immune response during recovery from the viral infection, and that will cause a formation of antibodies, which is specifically against platelet glycoprotein 2B and 3A, which we saw in the previous lecture. It is responsible for the platelet degradation, and so there is a since the antigen of a virus through a molecular mimicry, it will evoke a formation of antibody against the autoantigen, that's our own antigen that is on platelets. So alternative hypothesis, there is another hypothesis where immune complexes are basically deriving from primary or underlying disease, and they basically lead to opsonization on the surface of the platelets and rapid destruction through the complement system. So basically any viral infection or any insult and leading to immune complexes in the platelet surfaces and destruction and removal by the reticuloendothelial cells system in the spleen and the liver, and that will cause thrombocytopenia. Mainly the children affected is around 2 to 10 years of age, and boys and girls are equally affected. Well, usually it is usually preceded with upper respiratory tract infection like chickenpox, rubella, hepatitis, pertussis, and there will be a sudden onset of petechiae or purpura. Petechiae, as is talked about, is a flat it's a flat small reddish marks on the skin, which is as much which size is less than 1 millimeter, and which is usually non-blanchable and non-palpable. And purpura is basically a coalescence of petechiae or a collection of petechiae, and it's still in cases of immune-mediated thrombocytopenia it is non-palpable, while in cases of vasculitis you will have a palpable purpura. So there will be bleeding, can be in the mucosal surfaces or hemorrhagic bullae of gums, and especially these are called wet purpuras, while on the nasal bleeds or the epistaxis. So most commonly these small kids will come with epistaxis or history of recurrent epistaxis, and the more dreaded or severe complication of ICH is very rare. So this is the typical presentation. These are the petechiae, which is small discrete red papules less than 1 millimeter in size, which is flat and non-blanchable and mostly on the dependent areas of the body, and even some conjunctival hemorrhage can be appreciated in such patients. The liver and spleen may be palpable in minority of the patients, but not necessarily you will have a palpable spleen, and they can be anemic if they were hemorrhagic very severe. So usually the clinical tenure is like almost 80 to 90% undergoing patients with ITP, which they have a spontaneous recovery, while the rest recover within 4 to 8 weeks, and around 10 to 20% of these children they convert into chronic ITP. Chronic ITP is that is a duration will be more than 12 months, and they will have symptoms and acute exacerbation all their life, and but most of them again they have a spontaneous recovery, and the case fatality is very less, and especially the principal reason for that is intracranial hemorrhage. So basically we have two types of ITP. Short one is acute, which is shorter, and the course one is 6 months, and more specifically you have 6 to 12 months of the ITP, which can be labeled as chronic ITP. And the difference in acute and the chronic is basically more frequent in adolescent and young adults, mostly females, and usually it's a chronic onset of disease, and usually not very severe, and the course is usually more than 6 months, and platelet counts will be somewhere around more than 30,000, while in cases of acute ITP will be as less than 20,000, and number of megakaryocytes are increased in the acute ITP, while it is markedly increased in cases of chronic ITP. And the best thing to study is a peripheral smear, where we'll have an isolated thrombocytopenia with no other abnormalities. Usually the shape might be a megakaryocytes in the bone marrow, but otherwise the shape of the platelet will be a little larger, but there won't be any other abnormalities as far as shape and structure of the platelets are concerned. So that is one very important way of looking at this disease. WBC morphology will be almost be normal. Hemoglobin values are normal. Coagulation profile is like prothrombin time or activated thromboplastin time are usually normal. But the only thing which will be abnormal will be bleeding time. And bone marrow examination, you can have increased number of megakaryocytes. So basically this is to indicate that there is a normal platelet production, but the thrombocytopenia in this situation is basically due to increased platelet destruction. So another thing can be done is measuring antiplatelet antibodies, but this is not very practical and not very necessary for the diagnosis of ITP. ITP is basically a diagnosis of exclusion. You exclude all the other causes for low platelet count, and then clinical assessment and the history of the patient is very important. And then we basically look for the peripheral smear and look for the even a bone marrow examination is not even required in most of the cases. So these tests are basically have they lack in specificity and sensitivity, especially in acute ITP. So the diagnosis should be based on an infection history, clinical feature, physical examination, and a very suboptimal laboratory tests. And the treatment is basically for acute ITP or there is any acute exacerbation. Platelet transfusion is to be avoided unless and until it's very life-threatening, very emergency, because the transfused platelet may induce antiplatelet antibodies, and that will lead to further destruction of the platelets. So if basically the management of ITP depends upon the symptoms basically. Usually when you have a chronic ITP and with no or minimal or mild, usually no symptoms with platelet count more than 30,000, you need a monitoring of the patients. And then if there is a certain symptom, then you think about initiating a treatment, and just in order to not only cut down the cost and also to cut down on the side effects. So the treatment of choice for acute exacerbation is intravenous immunoglobulin, and which leads to rapid rise in platelets in 95% of the patient within 48 hours. And basically it appears to induce a response by down regulating the this Fc mediated phagocytosis of the antibody coated platelets. So but the IVIG therapy is very expensive, and there are high chances of headaches and vomiting, and there can be chances of IVIG induced aseptic meningitis, which is one of the dreaded complications. Then especially for RHD positive patients, you can use IV NTD at a dose of 70 to 50 microgram per kg, and that can again lead to rise in platelet count within 48 to 72 hours. Then the most important and most trusted treatment or most practical treatment is steroids, and they can be continued for 2 to 3 weeks and taper according to the rise in platelet count. And you have certain side effects with the long-term corticosteroid therapy, as you all know. Then splenectomy in ITP is usually reserved for a very selected group of patients, especially a child who is old enough and with severe ITP which has lasted for more than 1 year, or whose symptoms are not easily controlled with therapy, or if there is a life-threatening hemorrhage, or if the platelet count cannot be corrected by platelet transfusion and administration of immunoglobulin and corticosteroid. In that state, you can basically resort to splenectomy. So usually sequences spontaneous recovery is the norm, and significant bleeding and mortality is very less. And chronic ITP, again 20% will ultimately have the spontaneous resolution of their thrombocytopenia. So the next topic is thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura. This is which we talked about the immune-mediated thrombocytopenic. What we talked about was the immune-mediated platelet destruction, and this is a cause of non-immune-mediated platelet destruction. And this very thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura is basically not very common, and it is usually associated with an enzyme deficiency called ADAM-TS13. The ADAM-TS13 is basically responsible for for dissolution of multimers of von Willebrand factors. This von Willebrand that it's responsible for platelet adhesion. They exist in these smear in the form of or in the plasma. In a form of multimer, which is a long and a complex chain, and they have to be, as we'll see in the next slides, they have to be dissolved into a simpler form in so that there will be an appropriate platelet adhesions on the as a part of a primary hemostasis. And actually the TTP is a very it's a very fatal disease. Mortality rate is as high as 90%, but after the plasma exchange have come into play and it has been used as a therapy, the mortality rate has come down to less than 20%. So you have a pentate, classical pentate for TTP in the form of microangiopathic hemolytic anemia, thrombocytopenia, renal insufficiency or abnormalities, neurological abnormalities that can be fluctuating, and fever. These five are the forms a classical pentate of TTP, and the most common presentation can be non-specific like abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, weakness. And this I was talking about the ADAM-TS. You have ultra-large von Willebrand multimers which are seen from the endothelial cells. And usually the circulating normal von Willebrand factors multimers are basically broken down into small chains, but if there is absence or deficiency of ADAM-TS13, you will have a circulating ultra large WBF multimers, and these multimers on any insult on the endothelium or any endothelial dysfunction will lead to the addition of platelets, and it will form on the microvessels, it will form microclots, and these microthrombi will go while RBCs which when traverse through these microthrombi, it will lead to breakdown of RBCs and formation of spherocytes, cystiocytes, which can be seen on a blood smear as a broken down RBCs. So these are the spherocytes. So as the RBC traverses through the narrow lumen, it broken down into several small cystocytes. So basically the manifestation will be in the form of thrombocytopenia, and that can be in the form of epistaxis or petechiae or gingival bleeding or gastrointestinal bleeding, or even a neurological manifestation which can be even very flitting, or which can be a subtle confusion or headache or paresis, or it can be as significant as encephalopathy or coma, but mostly it is a very non-specific and variable neurological features. And the other non-specific symptoms are pallor, jaundice, fatigue, and arthralgia due to those RBCs, intravascular hemolysis. And jaundice are again resulting from the microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. And then basically it happens to small vessels, that's why it's called microangiopathic. Small vessels are affected as the RBC traverses through those small vessels because of the formations of these dense platelet thrombi or microthrombi, and because of the inability of von Willebrand factor to exist in a small simpler form, so that will lead to breaking down of RBCs. And as these products goes through the kidney, it can lead to proteinuria and microhematuria and subsequent renal failure. and there can be a heart failure or abdominal pain or GIT symptoms too. So the TTP can be congenital, acquired, and in acquired form you have autoimmune form where autoantibodies against the ADAMTS13 is found, and there is a massive endothelial activation with the release of ultra-shed large VW Volvilobrand multimers in a large amounts. So congenital type is very rare, and it's usually is manifested immediately after birth or during childhood. And again, will be a homozygous or a double heterozygous mutation in ADAMTS genes, and which can be inherited as an autosomal recessive manner. But the acquired form is mostly it accounts for 99% of the adolescent and the adult cases. And again, there will be anti-ADMTS antibodies, and that inhibits the proteolytic activity of the ADAMTS13, and that's how these antibodies are usually of IgG type, and especially in Afro-Caribbean people, there are high incidence of autoimmune idiopathic TTPs. And for a diagnosis purpose, basically you need the whole blood picture will be seen, where you will find a reticular count, hepatoglobulin will be decreased, reticulocyte count will be increased because of the hemolysis, clotting screening including fibrinogen, the whole screening will be done, and usually this will be normal. This is how it is differentiated from DIC, where the fibrinogen levels will be high because of the consumption of the fibrinogen. Then urea electrolyte may be altered because of the renal impairment. TROP-I levels may be high because of the cardiac involvement. Liver function tests are usually normal. Calcium may be reduced, especially in cases of plasma exchange therapies. LDH will be raised due to hemolysis, urinalysis for protein, and these are especially for hepatitis A, B, C, and HIV viruses. Testing is very important for any since we will have to implant transfusion, blood transfusion therapy or plasma exchange therapy, and there can be pre-blood products, or we have to exclude an underlying viral precipitants. So how do you approach a case of thrombotic microcytic thrombotic microangiopathic thrombotic TTP? How would you, whenever there is a suspicion of a TTP, you have first thing you have to look for the any patient with microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. You have to look for the ADAMTS13 activity. If it's greater than 10%, no need to worry. If it's less than 10%, you can proceed with the diagnosis of TTP, and where you get an anti-TTP antibodies, ADAMTS antibodies, and if it's positive, it responds to autoimmune TTP. But if it's negative, then again you have to there are chances it might be negative in remission or anti-ADAMTS13 IgG during relapses. So mostly the rough about you will find the ADAMTS activity less than 13% in the most cases of TTP. Well, this graph is not practically important from your point of view. So this is a Plasmin score, which is again beyond the scope of this lecture. So conditions and disease which are associated with TTP or be predisposes to TTP as a pregnancies, postpartum infection, even drug-induced chemotherapy or allogenic bone marrow transplants or connective tissue disorders or cardiac surgeries. Again, we're talking about the treatment plan for thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura. The current therapy is basically daily plasma exchange, which is the most important therapy for removal of these volvilobrand factors, which are ultra large volvilobrand factors, removing any autoantibodies and replenishing ADAMTS13. Immunosuppression can inhibit autoantibody formation in the form of corticosteroid or rituximab, which is an anti-CD20 antibody which acts on the B cells, and because the mortality is very high, and we have to initiate this plasma exchange therapy as soon as possible. And even after disease may exacerbate within weeks after stopping plasma exchange, and there can be plasma exchange related complications. Hypocalcemia is very common in such cases. So basically, this is a chart where we are showing the differential diagnosis of TMA is basically hemolytic uremic syndrome, which can be which a condition very almost similar in presentation to DTP, except for the neurological findings and the fever. And then you have again you have hemolytic uremic syndrome, which is associated with Shigella-like toxins. And basically you have lesser platelet count in all the three conditions, and you have microangiopathic hemolysis with cystocytes, elevated LDH, decreased haptoglobin or decreased hemoglobin, all these conditions. And then again the clinical features like neurological, renal, GIT, visual, pulmonary and cardiovascular symptoms is much more common in almost any one or more of the following will be present in all the three conditions. Then you evaluate ADAM-TS activity or Shigella-like toxins. If ADAM-TS activity is less than 5%, it corresponds to TTP. But if ADAM-TS activity is more than 5%, and if there is a Shigella toxin negative, then you can very assuredly you can consider it as a hemolytic atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome. And if Shigella toxin or intrahemorrhagic intracolon toxins are positive, then it is a typical hemolytic uremic syndrome. So hemolytic uremic syndrome and the this is basically, we'll just wrap it up. It's a clinical syndrome. It's almost similar to TTP, except you have macroangiopathic hemolytic anemia, thrombocytopenia, acute renal failure. And this acute renal failure is a more prominent feature of this condition. And the presence of fever is absence of fever is how the whole syndrome differentiated from TTP, and this is the most common cause of AKI in children. There are three types of HUC: typical, atypical, and due to complement abnormalities. And basically the typical one is infection related, usually a diarrheal infection, so E. coli or Shigella-like toxins, and you have especially serotype for that, which is O157, and you can have an even pneumococcal infection can cause typical HUS and certain virus and HIV infections. Then there is something called complement factor abnormalities, where you have factor H or factor I deficiency. And then miscellaneous causes are connective tissue diseases, drugs and malignancy, which causes atypical HUS. So typical HUS is basically a Shigella toxin associated on which is due to enterohemorrhagic E. coli or Shigella dysentery type 1. And source of infection is human fecal-oral transmission, milk and animal products which are incompletely cooked, or bakes or salads or drinking water. And there will be in this case you will have a damage to the endothelial cells. In TTP we remember there was the antibodies against the multimers volvilubrant factor, but out over here you have a damage to the endothelial cell. This is the primary event, and that will lead to formation of platelet adhesions and arterial and microthrombies, and further thrombotic microangiopathy and RBCs fragmentations. Histopathologically, you will find capillary endothelium damage, this microvascular formation, tissue ischemia, and damage to erythrocytes, and consumptive thrombocytopenia. And bacterial toxin basically is produced in the colon, and intrahemorrhagic E. coli releases virotoxins, and which is structurally similar to Shigella toxins. And these toxins binds to the endothelium, and it disrupts the protein synthesis and endothelial cell damage, and it further causes the inflammatory and procoagulant cascade to intervene, and promotes microvascular thrombosis. And then the atypical one is One of those are invasive streptococcal pneumonial infection associated, where you have renal endothelial cell, erythrocyte, or platelets, especially Thomson-Frederick antigen on their surfaces, and it is protected by the neuraminidase acid, and the pneumococci, which presents enzyme neuraminidase, and that cleaves neuraminic acid from the cell surfaces, and there's TAG is exposed, and there is a IgM mediated anti-TAG response, and leading to antigen antibody binding, and leading to further immunological cascade, and with further glomerular, especially the glomerular endothelial dysfunctions, and hemolytic anemia, and platelet consumption, aggregation, and fall in GFR. So other triggers can be connective tissue disorder, drug induced, or influenza, or CMV, or salmonella post-transplant. And there is something entity called complement dysregulation that can be another familial cause for atypical HUS, where there is complement gene mutations, and leading to alternate opsonation and lysis of the platelets. The commonest clinical representation is, I said, this is one of the most common cause for the acute renal failure in young individuals, especially in children between 1 to 5 years. The patient might present with oliguria, and usually it will accompany mostly the typical ones will accompany an incident of diarrhea or dysentery 1 to 2 weeks prior. But the atypical one basically might be the insult might be a pneumococcal infection or a drug induced, and the children will present to you as with oliguria and acute pallor, and usually it develops 5 to 10 days after the onset of diarrhea. Hematuria, hypertension is very common. Complications of fluid overload may be there, like in the form of pulmonary edema, hypertensive encephalopathy. Despite thrombocytopenia, very importantly, the bleeding manifestations are rare. Neurological symptoms can be there in the form of irritability, encephalopathy, or seizures. On peripheral smears, you will find cystocyte, LDH increase, indirect bilirubin increase because of the hemolysis, creatinine and blood urea nitrogen may be increased. On a urine analysis, you might have hematuria, proteinuria, hemoglobinuria, and you might have to check for the Shiga toxins from the stool culture. Management is symptomatic. Basically, specific symptomatic therapies to look for to address the anemia and fluid lytic disturbances, to prevent acute renal failure, and to manage the hypertension and neurological dysfunctions. Most importantly, early dialysis can affect the there's no evidence that early dialysis can affect the outcome, but indication for dialysis can be any anuria or symptoms of uremia or symptoms of fluid overload, any severe lytic abnormalities in the form of hyperkalemia. Specific therapy is again plasma infusion and plasma exchange. And tissue plasminogen activator can be also used, but plasma infusion and plasma exchange is a very important therapy. And prevention wise, patient infected, they should have once they are infected, any attempts to prevent the progression from bloody diarrhea is usually unsuccessful. So antibiotics and anti-motility drugs are not recommended because it's not antibiotic responding, and vigorous fluid repletion during diarrheal phase is very important in order to avoid any renal impairment. Prognosis with aggressive treatment, more than 90% of the HUS can survive, and 9% of them can develop end-stage renal disease, and even 1/3 of the patients with HUS have abnormal kidney function many years later, and they may require a long-term dialysis or renal replacement therapy. And 8% of the patients with HUS have other lifelong complications like high blood pressure, seizures, paralysis. This is all for HUS, and we'll just wrap up our this platelet disorder chapter. And they have certain platelet disorders in the form of congenital ones. And we'll see if we can take up those disorders in the next class, but they are more significant for your pediatrics lectures. So any questions you have, you can ask me, or you can fire in your questions through the message box. Or we'll just call it a day. Thank you, class. We'll see you the coming Wednesday.